April 4, 1975. The C-5A Galaxy transport aircraft sat on the tarmac at Tan Son Nhut Air Base, its massive cargo hold being loaded with the most precious cargo the United States military had ever transported: 243 orphan children, infants to toddlers, refugees from a war that was collapsing around them with the inevitability of a building whose foundation had been destroyed. The North Vietnamese army was 30 miles from Saigon and closing fast. The South Vietnamese government was in complete disarray. The American evacuation was accelerating into barely controlled chaos. And somewhere in Washington, someone had made a decision that these children, abandoned, orphaned, caught between two countries and two futures, deserved a chance at life even if everything else in Vietnam was rushing toward death. The operation was called Babylift, a name that sounded gentle and humanitarian, that conjured images of rescue and salvation, that masked the desperate reality of what was actually happening. The final acknowledgement that America was abandoning Vietnam, that the war was lost, that the only thing left was to save whoever could be saved before the country fell completely. The first flight would carry the children to the Philippines, then onward to the United States where adoptive families were waiting, where futures existed beyond the war zone. But this particular C-5A, tail number 680218, would never make it to the Philippines, would never deliver its cargo of children to safety, would crash 12 minutes after takeoff in circumstances so catastrophic that investigators would spend years trying to understand exactly what happened in those final moments when a routine evacuation became a disaster that killed 138 people, more than half of them children under the age of 5. This is the story of Operation Babylift's first flight, the deadliest aviation disaster in the history of humanitarian operations. Of the Air Force crew who knew their aircraft had catastrophic damage but tried to save it anyway because the alternative was unthinkable. Of the nurses and aid workers who held babies while the plane disintegrated around them, who made impossible choices about who to save when saving everyone was impossible. Of the children who survived, who would grow up in America with fragmented memories of a disaster they were too young to understand, carrying the psychological weight of being the ones who lived while others died. Of the families in America who'd been promised children and instead received notifications of death. Of the South Vietnamese orphanage workers who'd put children on that plane believing it was their only chance at survival, only to learn they'd sent them to their deaths. And of the political calculations that prioritized optics over safety, that rushed an operation because headlines mattered more than proper planning, that turned a humanitarian mission into a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The background to Operation Babylift was decades of war creating an entire generation of orphaned children in Vietnam, kids whose parents had been killed in combat or by the Viet Cong's political executions or by American bombing campaigns that couldn't distinguish between enemy combatants and civilians. International adoption agencies had been working in South Vietnam since the early 1960s, placing Vietnamese orphans with American families who wanted children, who believed they were giving these kids opportunities they'd never have in a war-torn country. By 1975, there were approximately 2,000 orphans in Saigon area orphanages, maintained by religious organizations and humanitarian groups, waiting for the paperwork that would allow them to leave. The fall of Saigon accelerated everything. As the North Vietnamese army pushed south, overwhelming South Vietnamese defenses that had depended on American support that was no longer coming, panic set in among the agencies caring for these children. If Saigon fell to communist forces, what would happen to orphans associated with American adoption programs? Would they be imprisoned, executed, used as propaganda tools? No one knew, but the possibilities were terrifying enough that the agencies began lobbying the U.S. government for emergency evacuation. President Gerald Ford, facing domestic criticism for the war's failure and desperate for positive headlines, approved Operation Babylift on April 3, 1975, announcing it with language designed to emphasize American compassion. We will bring these children to safety. We will give them the opportunities for life that every child deserves. We will show the world that even in our darkest moments, America stands for humanitarian values. The reality was more complicated and more cynical than Ford's rhetoric suggested. Many of the children designated for evacuation weren't actually orphans. They had parents who'd been told that sending their kids to America temporarily would keep them safe during the final collapse, that they'd be reunited after the war ended, that this was a survival strategy rather than permanent separation. The adoption agencies, overwhelmed by the chaos and genuinely believing they were saving lives, didn't have time to verify family status, didn't conduct the background checks and legal processes that normally govern international adoption. They simply gathered children, processed the minimal paperwork required for emergency evacuation, and prepared them for flights that would begin on April 4. The first aircraft selected was a C-5A Galaxy, the largest military transport plane in the American arsenal, capable of carrying massive cargo loads, designed for strategic airlift of tanks and armored vehicles. Using it for children was improvisation born from desperation. It could carry far more people than passenger aircraft, could land at military bases rather than requiring civilian airports, could be loaded quickly and flown without the normal commercial aviation regulations that would have delayed departure. The Air Force crew assigned to the flight, Captain Dennis Traynor as pilot, First Lieutenant Tilford Harp as co-pilot, plus a full crew of flight engineers and loadmasters, understood the mission's importance but had serious concerns about using a cargo aircraft for this purpose. The C-5A wasn't designed for passenger transport. The cargo hold lacked proper seating, lacked sufficient oxygen systems for this many people, lacked the safety features that would be standard on any civilian aircraft carrying passengers. But orders were orders, and the crew believed, as military personnel are trained to believe, that their superiors had made appropriate risk assessments. The loading process at Tan Son Nhut on the morning of April 4 was chaos barely contained by desperate organization. 243 children, ranging from infants only weeks old to toddlers around 4 years, were carried aboard by Vietnamese orphanage workers, American aid personnel, and military volunteers. The babies were placed in cardboard boxes lined with blankets, stacked along the cargo hold floor because there were no infant seats, no proper restraints, nothing designed for transporting people this young. The older children sat on the floor or were held by the adult escorts, 62 aid workers, medical personnel, and military support staff who'd volunteered to accompany the children on this first flight. The noise was overwhelming, babies crying, toddlers frightened by the massive aircraft, adults trying to maintain calm while processing their own fear about what they were doing. Regina Aun, a nurse with Friends of the Children of Vietnam, held a 6-month-old infant and thought about how insane this was, how they were putting hundreds of children into a cargo plane's hold with minimal safety equipment and hoping everything would work out. But what was the alternative? Leave them in Saigon? Wait for proper passenger aircraft that might not arrive before the city fell? This was the only option that felt like action rather than abandonment, even if it was terrifying. The C-5A took off at 4:15 p.m., lifting off from Tan Son Nhut with a load far exceeding its designed passenger capacity, climbing into the humid Vietnamese afternoon with its precious cargo, heading east toward the South China Sea and the planned route to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. For 12 minutes, everything seemed fine. The aircraft climbed to approximately 23,000 feet. The crew performed their standard post-takeoff checks. In the cargo hold, the adults were trying to calm the children, distributing bottles to infants, singing songs to toddlers, creating some semblance of routine in the utterly abnormal situation. Then, at 4:27 p.m., the rear cargo door, a massive pressure-sealed door that formed the aircraft's tail ramp, explosively decompressed. The technical explanation involved complex engineering about locking mechanisms and pressure differentials, but the practical result was simple and catastrophic. A door the size of a 2-story building suddenly opened during flight, creating immediate decompression that ripped through the cargo hold with the force of a bomb. The pressure wave tore through the aircraft. Adults holding children were yanked toward the opening. Cardboard boxes containing infants slid across the floor toward the void. The structural damage was immediate. The decompression severed hydraulic lines that controlled the aircraft's flight surfaces, essentially destroying the pilot's ability to control the plane. Captain Traynor, in the cockpit, felt the aircraft pitch violently downward and knew instantly they were in catastrophic trouble. Every warning light on his panel was illuminated. The hydraulic gauges showed total system failure. The aircraft was responding to control inputs erratically or not at all. He had maybe minutes to figure out how to land a crippled aircraft carrying hundreds of children who were already dying in the depressurized cargo hold. The adults in the cargo hold experienced something beyond nightmare. The decompression created a wind tunnel effect, a hurricane-force suction pulling everything toward the open rear door. Regina Aun, holding her infant, felt herself being dragged toward the opening, saw other escorts losing their grip on children, watched in horror as cardboard boxes containing babies slid past her and disappeared into the sky. Some adults managed to wedge themselves against structural supports, creating human anchors to hold children. Others lost their grip, tumbled toward the opening, fell from 23,000 feet into the jungle below. The older children who could understand what was happening screamed with a terror that would haunt survivors for decades. The infants cried or went silent from shock or lack of oxygen in the thinning air. And through it all, the aircraft was plummeting, its nose pointed down at an angle that made standing impossible, that turned the cargo hold into a slide toward death. Captain Trainer was attempting the impossible. Flying an aircraft with no hydraulics meant controlling it solely through engine thrust, varying power to the 4 massive engines to create turning forces, a technique that had been theorized but rarely tested because it required perfect timing and conditions that were never perfect. He had to slow their descent, level the aircraft somehow, find a place to crash land because actual landing was impossible without hydraulic control of landing gear and flaps. His co-pilot was reading off altitude, airspeed, trying to give Trainer the information he needed to make micro-adjustments that might save some of the people aboard. The flight engineer was trying to restore hydraulics, to find some workaround, to create options where none existed. And they all knew that in the cargo hold behind them, children were dying, had already died, were continuing to die with every second they couldn't stabilize the aircraft. The decision to attempt an emergency landing rather than ordering bailout was made instantly and without discussion because the alternative, abandoning an aircraft full of children, was unthinkable even if staying aboard meant dying with them. Trainer identified a rice paddy approximately 2 miles from Tan Son Nhut, a flat area that might allow for a controlled crash, and aimed for it while fighting an aircraft that wanted to spiral into the ground. The final 60 seconds were captured on the cockpit voice recorder, a device that would later be analyzed by investigators trying to understand the crew's actions, the terse communication between pilots, the engineering readouts of airspeed and altitude, the background noise of alarms indicating multiple system failures, and underneath it all, barely audible but unmistakable, the sound of children screaming from the cargo hold. At 4:45 p.m., 18 minutes after the cargo door failure, the C-5A impacted the rice paddy at approximately 250 knots, far faster than any survivable landing speed, at an angle that sent the aircraft skipping across the water-saturated ground like a stone on a pond. The initial impact killed people through deceleration, the sudden stop that turned forward momentum into lethal force. The aircraft broke apart on the second impact, the fuselage fracturing into multiple sections that scattered across the paddy. Fire broke out immediately, fed by thousands of gallons of jet fuel, turning sections of the wreckage into infernos that trapped people who'd survived the crash itself. The survivors described scenes from a war zone, which made sense given that many of them were veterans who'd seen combat and said this was worse because the victims were children. The forward section of the aircraft, where some of the crew and escorts had been positioned, remained relatively intact after impact and people were able to evacuate before fire consumed it. The cargo hold, where most of the children had been, was destroyed, some sections compressed into twisted metal, others torn open by the forces of impact, creating a debris field of wreckage and bodies that stretched across 200 meters of rice paddy. The local Vietnamese villagers reached the crash site before official rescue teams, pulling survivors from the wreckage, carrying injured children through the mud, trying to organize triage when they had no medical training and no equipment. American military helicopters arrived within 20 minutes, medevacing the most severely injured to field hospitals, but for many of the children the injuries were too catastrophic. Blunt force trauma, burns, smoke inhalation compounded by their already fragile condition as malnourished infants. The final casualty count would take days to establish with certainty: 138 dead, including 78 children under the age of 5. 176 survivors, many with injuries that would require months of treatment. The mathematics were brutal, more than 40% fatality rate on what was supposed to be a rescue mission. The immediate aftermath was confusion, blame, and desperate damage control by everyone involved. The Air Force launched an investigation into the cargo door failure, eventually determining it was a combination of mechanical malfunction and design flaw. Locking pins that were supposed to secure the door had failed, something that shouldn't have been possible but was because of maintenance issues and manufacturing defects that hadn't been caught during inspections. Captain Trainer and his crew were praised for attempting the impossible, for getting the aircraft back to ground when all engineering analysis suggested it should have spiraled into the jungle, for saving anyone when everyone should have died. But Trainer would spend the rest of his life haunted by the children he couldn't save, the decision to use a cargo aircraft for passengers, the knowledge that proper safety protocols would have prevented the entire disaster. The adoption agencies faced immediate criticism for rushing the evacuation, for not properly vetting the children's status, for prioritizing optics and headlines over safety. Internal documents revealed that concerns about using the C-5A had been raised and dismissed, that faster timelines had been imposed by political pressure from Washington, that the agencies had known the risks and proceeded anyway because the alternative, doing nothing, seemed worse. President Ford, who'd announced Operation Babylift with such fanfare, was forced to address the disaster while continuing to defend the operation itself, creating the awkward position of mourning the dead while insisting their deaths were worth it because other children were saved by subsequent flights. The operation continued despite the crash. Over the next 3 weeks, Operation Babylift would evacuate approximately 3,300 children from Vietnam using different aircraft and modified procedures. The political calculus was clear. Stopping after the first disaster would mean the deaths were meaningless, while continuing meant framing them as tragic but necessary casualties in a larger humanitarian mission. The children who survived the crash, and the thousands evacuated on subsequent flights, became symbols of the war's complicated legacy, living proof of American intervention's humanitarian aspirations and its catastrophic failures existing simultaneously in the same small bodies. Many were adopted by American families who'd been waiting for them, who accepted children with severe injuries and trauma because they'd committed to giving these kids homes. Others remained in institutions, their injuries too severe or their documentation too incomplete for adoption to proceed. And some, as they grew older and learned their histories, began asking uncomfortable questions about Operation Babylift itself. Were they actually orphans or were they children taken from families who'd expected temporary separation? Was the evacuation truly humanitarian or was it primarily a propaganda operation designed to salvage American image during the final collapse of Vietnam? Did the adults who'd made these decisions prioritize the children's welfare or their own political and emotional needs? Heidi Munson, who'd been 6 months old on the crashed flight and survived with severe burns, spent her adult life investigating her origins, eventually traveling to Vietnam and discovering that her orphan status was false. Her mother was alive, had never consented to adoption, had been told by orphanage workers that sending Heidi to America temporarily would keep her safe and they'd be reunited after the war. The reunion, 40 years delayed, was joyful and devastating simultaneously, proof that at least some of Operation Babylift's children were taken rather than rescued, removed from families by a combination of desperation, miscommunication, and the arrogance of believing American homes were inherently better than Vietnamese families regardless of what those families wanted. The crash site in the rice paddy was never properly memorialized. Within weeks the wreckage was cleared, the dead were buried or cremated, and the location returned to agricultural use because Vietnam had no capacity to maintain memorials during the final chaotic month before Saigon fell. The American government erected a small plaque at Clark Air Base in the Philippines honoring those who died, a gesture that felt inadequate to survivors who believed the disaster deserved more recognition, more investigation into the decisions that caused it, more accountability for the people whose choices led to children dying in a preventable crash. Regina Aun, the nurse who'd held an infant during the decompression and somehow survived, became an advocate for aviation safety regulations, testifying before Congress about the dangers of using military cargo aircraft for passenger transport, about the pressure to prioritize speed over safety during evacuations, about the need for oversight when humanitarian operations involve vulnerable populations. Her advocacy contributed to regulatory changes, new protocols for emergency evacuations, requirements that even in crisis situations certain safety minimums must be maintained. It was something, a legacy built from tragedy, though it couldn't return the children who'd died or restore the innocence of the ones who'd survived with permanent psychological scars. The political fallout was muted because Operation Babylift occurred during the final collapse of South Vietnam when public attention was fragmented across multiple crises. The desperate evacuations from Saigon, the images of helicopters pushing off aircraft carriers to make room for more refugees, the North Vietnamese tanks rolling through the presidential palace on April 30, marking the war's absolute end. The crash became a footnote to larger stories, remembered primarily by the families directly affected and largely forgotten by a public exhausted by Vietnam and eager to move on. This historical amnesia meant the lessons weren't fully learned, the accountability wasn't fully achieved, the questions about whether Operation Babylift was truly humanitarian or primarily political theater were never definitively answered. What's certain is that 138 people died on that first flight, that the majority were children under 5, that their deaths resulted from decisions made by adults who believed they were doing the right thing but who prioritized action over caution, optics over safety, the appearance of rescue over the reality of risk. Whether those trade-offs were justified depends on your perspective. If you're one of the 3,300 children who survived the subsequent flights and built lives in America, Operation Babylift was salvation regardless of its flaws. If you're one of the families who lost children in the crash, or one of the Vietnamese mothers who discovered decades later that your child wasn't rescued but taken, the operation looks more like catastrophic failure dressed in humanitarian language. The crew of the C-5A, the ones who survived and the ones who died trying to save the aircraft, were military personnel following orders, doing their jobs under impossible circumstances, making split-second decisions with incomplete information and catastrophic consequences regardless of what they chose. Captain Trainer flew that crippled aircraft for 18 minutes, kept it airborne long enough to reach the rice paddy rather than crashing into populated areas, saved 176 people through skill and determination and probably luck. He received commendations, was praised in official reports, and then quietly left the Air Force 2 years later because he couldn't reconcile the praise with his memories of children's screams on the cockpit voice recorder. First Lieutenant Harp, the co-pilot, stayed in the military, eventually reaching the rank of colonel, but he never spoke publicly about the crash except once, in a documentary filmed in 2005, when he said something that captured the operation's essential tragedy. "We were trying to save them. We believed we were doing the right thing. But good intentions don't prevent crashes, don't bring back the dead, don't change the fact that we put hundreds of children on an aircraft we knew wasn't designed for passengers because the politics demanded action and action meant risk and someone had to bear that risk. The children bore it, we just had to live with it." The nurses and aid workers who'd volunteered for that first flight, who'd held babies during the decompression, who'd made impossible choices about which children to try to save when saving everyone was physically impossible, carried psychological wounds that never fully healed. Many developed PTSD, suffered from survivor's guilt, struggled with relationships because how do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it's like to watch an infant you're holding get sucked out of an aircraft at 23,000 feet? Some found therapy helpful, others turned to advocacy work as a way to create meaning from trauma, channeling their experiences into causes that prevented future disasters. But all of them lived with the knowledge that they'd been part of something that killed children while trying to save them, that their humanitarian impulses had been weaponized by political calculations they didn't fully understand at the time, that their compassion had been exploited by systems that viewed them as useful participants in operations where success was measured in headlines rather than actual welfare of the children involved. The Operation Babylift children who survived, both from the crashed flight and from the subsequent successful evacuations, grew up American, adopted into families across the United States, raised with varying degrees of knowledge about their origins and the circumstances of their arrival. Some thrived, became doctors and lawyers and teachers, built families and lives that justified the operation's humanitarian rhetoric. Others struggled with identity, with belonging, with the trauma of separation from birth culture even when they had no conscious memory of Vietnam. And a few, like Heidi Munson, eventually returned to Vietnam and discovered that their origin stories were more complicated than they'd been told, that orphan was sometimes a convenient label applied to children who had families, that rescue and kidnapping can look remarkably similar depending on whether you ask the rescuers or the people being rescued from. The 40th anniversary of Operation Babylift in 2015 brought renewed attention, documentaries and articles re-examining the operation with the perspective of decades and access to declassified documents that revealed more about the political motivations behind it. The picture that emerged was messy, genuine humanitarian concern for children's welfare coexisting with cynical political calculation about American image during the war's final collapse, dedicated aid workers operating alongside bureaucrats who viewed the operation primarily as public relations, real orphans evacuated alongside children who had families that wanted them back. The crash of the first flight represented all these contradictions concentrated into one catastrophic event. The humanitarian mission that killed the people it was supposed to save, the rescue operation that resulted from political pressure overriding safety concerns, the adults who did their best in impossible circumstances created by other adults' decisions. History hasn't reached a consensus on whether Operation Babylift was primarily noble or primarily cynical because the evidence supports both interpretations simultaneously, because humanitarian operations are rarely pure and political operations are rarely completely devoid of genuine human concern. What remains 49 years later are the survivors, now in their late 40s and 50s, living ordinary American lives, carrying extraordinary histories. They are accountants and teachers and parents, people who happen to have survived one of the worst aviation disasters in humanitarian history when they were too young to remember it consciously but old enough to be shaped by it psychologically. They gather occasionally at reunions, sharing stories and supporting each other through the complex emotions of being the ones who lived when others died, of being beneficiaries of an operation that was simultaneously rescue and removal, of having lives that wouldn't exist if not for decisions made during panic and desperation. Some maintain connections to Vietnam, learning the language, visiting regularly, building bridges between their American present and Vietnamese past. Others view themselves as purely American, their Vietnamese origins and accident of birth less important than the families who raised them in the country where they built their lives. There's no single narrative that captures all their experiences, no definitive answer to whether Operation Babylift was right or wrong, successful or failed, humanitarian or exploitative. The memorial that doesn't exist at the crash site, the accountability that was never fully achieved, the children whose deaths were mourned but quickly forgotten by everyone except the families who loved them. These absences define Operation Babylift as much as the children who were saved. It's a story about adults making impossible decisions under catastrophic circumstances, about systems that prioritize action over caution, about the gap between humanitarian intentions and humanitarian outcomes. The C-5A Galaxy that crashed carried children toward futures in America, toward safety from a war that was ending in chaos and violence, toward lives their parents wanted for them even if it meant permanent separation. It also carried them toward death when the cargo door failed, toward a rice paddy where 138 people would die, toward a tragedy that revealed how humanitarian operations can fail catastrophically when political pressure overrides proper planning. Both realities are true simultaneously. The operation saved thousands of children who might have died or suffered if they'd remained in Vietnam during its final collapse. The operation also killed children through preventable decisions made by adults who prioritized speed and optics over safety and proper protocols. These facts coexist uncomfortably, resistant to simple moral conclusions, demanding we acknowledge complexity rather than retreating into narratives of pure heroism or pure failure. Captain Dennis Traynor died in 2007 at age 73, having spent 32 years carrying the weight of that 18-minute flight. His obituary mentioned his military service, his family, his career after the Air Force. It didn't mention Operation Babylift because he'd requested it not be included, didn't want to be remembered for the crash even though it was the defining event of his life, the thing that shaped every day after April 4, 1975. His children found a journal after his death, entries written over decades processing the crash, the decisions he'd made, the children he couldn't save. One entry, dated April 4, 2005, exactly 30 years after the crash, read, "I did everything I could. I know that intellectually, but knowledge doesn't stop the dreams, doesn't silence the screams I hear from the cargo hold, doesn't change the fact that I was flying the aircraft when those children died. I was following orders, doing my job, making the best decisions possible with the information I had. But they're still dead, and I'm still here, and I don't know if that's fair or just how it is or whether fairness even applies to situations like that. I just know I'd do it again the same way because what else could I have done? And I know that answer isn't enough, but it's all I have." That's the legacy of Operation Babylift's first flight: survivors who don't know whether to be grateful or angry, families who lost children to a humanitarian mission, crew members who saved some people and couldn't save others and had to live with both realities simultaneously. A historical event that resists simple interpretation because the truth is complicated and contradictory and refuses to fit into neat categories of success or failure. The children who died in that rice paddy, whose names are listed on a memorial plaque that most people never see, were casualties of war as surely as any soldier killed in combat. Victims of decisions made by adults in distant capitals, of systems that prioritized other concerns over their safety, of the chaos that occurs when empires collapse and desperate people make desperate choices. They deserved better, deserved proper safety protocols, deserved aircraft designed for passengers, deserved adults who would prioritize their welfare over political timelines. But they were born into a war zone where nothing worked as it should, where desperation drove decision-making, where the choice was between imperfect rescue and certain doom. The adults who made the decision to use the C-5A, who loaded those children aboard despite concerns, who authorized takeoff knowing the risks, they believed they were saving lives. They were also taking risks with lives that weren't theirs to gamble. Both things are true. Both deserve acknowledgement. History remembers Operation Babylift as a humanitarian mission during the fall of Saigon, images of American compassion during retreat, evidence that even in defeat some values were maintained. It should also remember the 138 people who died on the first flight, the preventable disaster that resulted from political pressure overriding safety concerns, the children whose rescue became their death. Not as a condemnation of everyone involved, but as a reminder that humanitarian operations are conducted by humans who make mistakes, who face impossible choices, who sometimes do terrible things while trying to do good things. The crash of C-5A tail number 680218 on April 4, 1975 was a tragedy. It was also the result of specific decisions made by specific people for specific reasons. Understanding those reasons doesn't excuse the outcome, but it does illuminate why the outcome occurred. Why children died on a mission designed to save them, why good intentions produced catastrophic results, why Operation Babylift represents both the best and worst of American intervention in Vietnam. That complexity is uncomfortable. History prefers clear heroes and villains, obvious lessons, simple morals. But the truth about Operation Babylift's first flight offers none of those comforts, just the reality of humans trying to navigate impossible situations, making choices with incomplete information, living with consequences they couldn't fully predict, and carrying the weight of those consequences forever.